Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
Good evening. This is Dr. Dan, and this is Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum Live. So, during the height of the western wildfire season on July 4th, a random lightning strike started a small fire near the Grand Canyon. Instead of immediately extinguishing the fire, park officials decided to manage the fire as a controlled burn, calling it a confine and contain strategy. What could possibly go wrong with that? The government administrators obviously forgot about Mother Nature. Unexpected strong winds on July 11th caused the fire to rage out of control and burn down the Grand Canyon Lodge and many other buildings, including the Visitor Center on the Grand Canyon's north rim. So, when does managing a wildfire instead of putting it out make any sense? Apparently, it only makes sense if you are a federal government bureaucrat. Frank Carroll, forestry and wildlife expert of wildfirepros.com, is with me to discuss the tragic and unacceptable loss of forest and property in the Dragon Bravo fire. Now, Frank, this is not a new story. It seems as if this repeated mismanagement of wildfire by federal government agencies is a deliberate and negligent policy. What is your take on that?
Well, it's a fascinating history that started about 1970, and I won't go into all the details, but uh, actually allowing wildfires to burn or using fire to manage forests and so on is not a bad idea in the right circumstances. And in the early days of the policy, the right circumstances included, in this part of the world, in Arizona and so on, included July 15th, the establishment of monsoons. An inch of rain had to have fallen, and then we could let those fires burn with confidence, and they did a lot of good because ponderosa pine and other western forests are dependent on fire for health and well-being, and so it was actually a well-intentioned policy. But in the past decade, especially since 2009, but actually since before 2000, and especially with the Park Service, the Park Service has now never met a wildfire that they didn't think they could let burn under amazingly poor conditions. And that was the situation here. You might remember in 2000, they actually lit a prescribed burn at Bandelier National Monument, which burned into the National Fire Laboratories at Los Alamos, New Mexico, across all the munitions and all the great stuff there, and burned down Trinity Drive. Now, Trinity was the name of the Manhattan Project code word for the atomic bomb. And so this fire that the Park Service lit burned Trinity Drive and a whole bunch of homes of scientists, fabulous homes and so on. And so that was the first sort of major error that they committed. And then at Grand Canyon, when Dragon Bravo started, a little fire on July 4th in Arizona, in hot temperatures and predicted high winds, in no monsoons established, no rainfall. They let that fire burn, and they assured everybody in a press release a little while ago, they said that that fire was being managed by their experts, and the fire was getting expert management. and so it went, and it burned down we can talk about the rest of the story, but my take is there's a place for fire to do what fire does naturally. The place was not the Grand Canyon North Rim on July 4th.
Well, it seems to me that was a pretty dangerous decision. You have a national monument that has a huge number of visitors every single year. You had a lodge that was beautiful, had been there for decades. Sometimes people went just to go to the lodge because of how wonderful a place it was. It had accommodations for workers in the Grand Canyon, accommodations for visitors. It was a monument in and of itself. How did people think that putting that at risk would have any plus? Well, I don't understand what the plus is. Yeah, sure, forest fires are good in some circumstances, but why burn down a place like that, or even take the risk of burning down a place like that?
So in both the situation at Los Alamos and at Grand Canyon, it was Park Service hubris that caused the problem, really. And what that means is that in Los Alamos at 2000, they'd had a wonderful prescribed fire program under a great firefighter and resource manager named John Lissaway. And for 20 years, they'd effectively applied fire to Bandelier in the best possible way, and it did a lot of good. And he retired in 1999, and in 2000, his firefighters, staring in the rearview mirror at all their success, decided that worked so good, let's light all the rest of this stuff up. And they didn't have his former captain of infantry in Vietnam and so on a steady hand to tell them to slow down and take their foot off the gas. And so they ended up burning into the city and the national labs. In this case, the Park Service was also staring in the rear view mirror as they drove 70 miles an hour down the freeway. And what they looked at was, as recently as 2022, there was a fire called the Dragon Fire. And the Dragon Fire was a pretty successful let burn fire. And it was close to this fire, which is why they called this fire Dragon Bravo. You had fire A and fire B. And so if it worked a few years ago, by golly, let's rinse it off and let's repeat it. And so they, by the time they understood the error of their ways, it was too late. And Dragon Bravo is now over 25,000 acres and getting bigger as we speak.
So, obviously, this was an error. And you talk about hubris. Um, Hubris is what happens when bureaucrats feel that they have the power to do whatever they want to do, no matter what's good for the country or what's rather good for the problem that they are addressing. So they think, I know everything, I am king, I will do what I want, no matter what anyone else wants. Isn't that really what we're talking about here?
That's literally true in many of these cases, especially where natural resource management is concerned. There's a long history of this in which various environmental groups in particular forced the agencies into out of what we called active management, logging and thinning and so on, and into a position where they have no tools left in the management toolbox for these forests except fire. When you have a fire, a little lightning fire, a big fire, whatever it is, that's that fire is suddenly an emergency, and it's defined as an emergency. And Congress has appropriated dollars for the emergency fire suppression and the immediate suppression of fires. And in fact, that's their mandate. But they've learned, especially since the Chevron deference before it was overturned last year, that in a court of law and in fact in government policy and so on, their opinion was the ruling factor in all of this. And so yes, they whether they had counsel to the contrary or not, we don't know yet. But they certainly had indicators, plenty of indicators, and lots of experience that should have told them that this was going to be a disaster or could be a disaster. And you made an earlier point. Who managing a park would decide it was a good idea to let Bridie of the Grand Canyon burn? You know that story?
Yeah, why don't you tell that story? I think it's a good one.
Bridie is this beautiful little donkey, subject of children's stories in, I guess, the 50s and 60s. And Bridie of the Canyon was like Smokey Bear to the greater Forest Service and Park Service in many ways. And Bridie was what introduced many children to the Grand Canyon. And they did a magnificent bronze statue of Bridie, a life-size statue. And Bridie sat on her little haunches on the floor at the lodge and greeted, tens of thousands, millions of visitors over the years. And in the chaos of the retreat from the fire on the 12th of July, they left Bridie where she was, and she was severely damaged. She'll have to be recast. And so,
Well, yeah, that really is a tragedy in and of itself. But again, it comes back to you have a national monument, you have a wonderful structure that people love to see, that people go to because it is a wonderful structure, something worth actually seeing, maybe staying in or having a meal in or meeting friends there. Why put that at risk for any reason?
that's the question. And, I wrote an opinion editorial about this. I found out on Sunday afternoon that the lodge burned, and I immediately started writing. And I had friends tell me, wait a minute, you don't know what the investigation says, and you don't know what the factors were, and you don't know all the things that went into the decision. And I said, yes, I do. They let a fire burn, and it burned down the lodge. That's the end of the story. The proof is in the pudding, and the pudding is a smoldering ruin.
That's for sure. There is no other proof necessary.
No,
But it's amazing to me that anyone in charge of something as important as a national park and protecting the contents of that park would in any way risk putting something they're supposed to protect at risk. I mean, here was a fire. Here was a fire. It was a tiny lightning fire uh, in the beginning. You could barely even see it on the map. I might try. I might try to share a couple pictures here, if you will bear with me. Uh, let's see. Let me see if I can do that here. I don't know. I'll do that. No, that's not going to work. So I will do. I don't see it right now, but I'm gonna try it. See if I can get that up here. Hang on a minute, because at the very beginning, that's what I need to do. Okay, so at the very beginning, this was so small that there we go. On July 4th, that's what you're talking about. You see the arrow that says July 5th, and it's pointing to a tiny, tiny, and I mean tiny red dot. I don't even know if you can see that red dot.
well, I know
Um,
where it is, but I see your point. And look how close it is to this critical infrastructure.
Absolutely. Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what the fire is like July 15th, a mere 11 days after that. Um, so if you look at this, go. Now that's a whole different story, isn't it? I think you could see the original fire is up here where that little red dot is.
Yes.
And total mismanagement has turned that tiny little spot of red into a disaster that destroyed not only the lodge, but I understand the North Rim is going to be closed to tourists for the entire season.
Maybe for several seasons, because the story gets even better. The unexpected wins. Now, my good friend Rick Cables and I. Rick Cables was retired as the regional forester in charge of all the Forest Service in several states, Colorado and Wyoming and so on, parts of Nebraska. And he and I started fighting fire together in 1972 at Saguaro National, now park. It was Saguaro National Monument. We were on a wilderness fire crew and trail crew, and one of our charges, that was the beginnings of the natural fire regime in that part of the world. And one of our charges was that, after, as I said, after July 15th and the rain and the monsoons were established, we young firefighters were not allowed to put fire out. When a lightning strike started, we would go to it, we would monitor it, take pictures of it, see how it was doing, and watch it burn. And I've got to tell you, that was really tough for a bunch of 20-year-old kids, 19, 22-year-old kids. It was hard for us to watch those little tiny lightning strikes that started out as a little smoldering log or something turn into 40 days and 40 nights of fire, but we did it, and it was a spectacular experience. But The thing that was never unexpected, it was never unexpected in our ranks that in July, especially in early July, that there would be unexpected winds. No, we knew there would be winds, powerful winds. It was not unexpected that temperatures would trend drier, or the weather would be hotter. That we experienced it all summer long. And so when we woke up on the 12th, I guess it was astonishing to us in many ways that this decision had been made. Remember that the park superintendent at this park was a Department of Interior water lawyer, and he was installed as the superintendent over the ranks of far more dedicated, far more professional senior rangers who would have loved to have had that post. The post had been held by Albright and some of the most famous names in the Park Service. In fact, my wife's grandmother was this executive assistant to Albright and some of the most famous of the park superintendents in Yosemite and Grand Canyon and so on. And so they put this guy in that role, and he had a mission to fulfill. And his mission was to take care of the native peoples around there and try to tie them in with that feature and try to pull them into the government councils and so on. And I imagine he did a good job of that. But he has zero fire experience. And he had no way to fall back on anybody who did except for his fire organization. And his fire organization, his fire management officers and so on, were the people who were convinced that everything that they'd done to date was perfect, and this would go well. They did what's called a wildfire decision support system run, a Forest Service Pro run, to try to predict what the fire might do under various conditions. And what their FS Pro run told them is that there was only a 2% chance that the fire would do exactly what it did. 2%. And so for some reason, 2% was the balm of Gilead for them, and they felt that that was not only acceptable, but perfect odds. And so the interesting thing about that is that the fire that you just showed, the picture of the fire progress that you just showed, almost perfectly mirrors the Forest Service Pro prediction for the fire in various stages as it would progress across the land, first in a computer model and then in fact. And so we had the most senior levels of the service. I mean, in the old days, the park rangers like Albright and my father-in-law, Al Ayers, and so on, they could look at this situation and they had fire experience and they understood the vagaries of fire. And they got it that if you let a fire burn in heavy fuels in the middle of an old forest, there's a good chance that you'd have problems. And it would not have occurred to them to do this. More importantly, there is no law. Neither the organic acts of the Park Service nor subsequent legislation provide for the government to protect our public natural resources and things like our lodges and the internal infrastructure and so on by using wildfire. There's no provision for that. To make matters worse, the minute the fire bill goes off and a fire does start, including the little original lightning strike, they use what's called wildfire management dollars appropriated by Congress for emergency fire suppression to let the fire burn. They say, "Oh, we didn't let it burn. We did control lines and we had a confine, contain strategy. We're going to confine it to this area." And in fact, not only are we confining it to this little strike area, but we're going to build lines outside that area in several different locations to make sure that if it does get away, we can stop it at the lines that we built. So they were feeling quite safe. In the unexpected winds that rose on the 12th, their lines not only didn't hold, but their plan, called a management action plan, was to ignite those indirect lines, we call them, those lines outside of the main fire area, so they could burn their fire from their predetermined lines back to the lightning strike and stop the fire in its tracks. The only problem was they were so disorganized and it was so chaotic that nobody lit those lines on fire. And, I'm not sure it would have done any good anyway, but be that as it may, none of those plans and none of their confidence was warranted. And so, go ahead.
See, what I have here is again just it just didn't make sense to me. We had a fire in our area, a lightning strike started a tree on fire. They did not put it out. It ended up burning an entire ridge, homes on both ends of the ridge. It was like a cigar. Ends of the ridge, both on both ends of the ridge, homes were endangered. People's lives and property were endangered because they just didn't put it out when it was small. I mean, it's kind of like having a fire in your backyard and say, "I think I'm going to go take a nap."
That
And
is exactly like that. But this gets better. So when the fire did its thing, remember what some famous politicians have said about there's always opportunity in chaos. They decided that was, oh, well, we lost the place. In fact, the senior park public information officer in Washington, D.C. for the Park Service opined that when challenged about what they'd done, she said, we have done exactly what we meant to do in the way that we meant to do it. The fire's being managed by our experts. They're doing an expert job. And hey, nobody died, she said. And so they called in a Type 1 fire team from the Southwest region made up of a bunch of fire experts from different agencies and the departments and so on. And that team came in and they decided that this fire was such a good opportunity that not only are we going to try to suppress it, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but we're going to do it in a way that burns another so far 23,000 acres. Remember, we had a lightning strike, and an acre is a little bigger. It is a little smaller than a football field. So 23,000 acres as of yesterday afternoon, growing as we speak. And they have their maps. I sent you a map, and you can check it out. Maybe you can look at it later. But showing that their actual control lines and their actual intentions are to burn about in the neighborhood of 50,000, perhaps more acres. Now, this is not about firefighter safety. It's not safe for firefighters to be in that situation. A very similar fire that only didn't get the limelight because of Grand Canyon was occurring in New Mexico called the Laguna Fire. And on the Laguna Fire, the burners, as I call them, decided that they were going to light some allotments on fire where cattle graze and so on. And they did so, and they killed 50 head of the Vigil family's cows. And so what we're talking about is the most troubling thing about all of this is that it may be the hubris of these agencies and so on, but in the end, their decisions to let lightning strikes burn, for example, and they let other fires burn as well, or to expand them on purpose, involves private property and other municipal property and public property. And by the way, that's our property. You own Bridie of the Canyon. I own Bridie of the Canyon. Nobody asked us if this was a great idea. And so with in this way, they're compounding their errors by first making a bad decision, but then taking advantage of the bad decision to do something that's potentially even worse. My friend, the regional forester, asked me today. He said, "Well, what does that fire look like in those pine stands?" And I don't know because I haven't looked at it. But the way the fire's behaving and the intense heat that's all over the place. If you never walked in those forests, it was one of the most thrilling things in nature. It was an old growth ponderosa pine forest with huge, old, beautiful, huge, tall ponderosa pines. And it was like walking in a cathedral of pine trees is how I thought of it. I grew up in that kind of situation. And so when they make these decisions, and especially now the compounding decision of using this wildfire to reintroduce fire to fire-depleted ecosystems. Fire-depleted ecosystems, which, by the way, includes your private property and the ridge you talked about with all the houses on it and so on. They're making decisions that involve a lot of us and that horribly impact a number of us, not to mention the smoke damage and smoke deaths with people with COPD and so on. And so they make those decisions, and they're shielded by law from having to pay anybody back for what they do. So in inverse condemnation, a guy could knock on your door tomorrow from the government and send a bulldozer through your studio and seize your property for public purposes. That's inverse condemnation. And you could, under the Tucker Act, they have to pay you for seizing your property for public purposes. In the case of burning, when they burn your property for public purposes, they are not required to reimburse you. And while it's possible they will, you have to go through a hell of a legal battle to get that done. And so the not only is the policy highly suspect and even extremely destructive in many ways, but there's no way for the government. There's no legal operation. There's no legal way they have to reimburse people for the consequences of their bad decisions. What they say is, well, gosh, these usually go really great. And I think the chief of the Forest Service a while back in the last administration said that they had 99% success with these prescribed burns and so on. But that's not the question. The question is in the failures, like Los Alamos and the 2022 Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fires that burned through all those communities in northern New Mexico, 350,000 acres, and the Black Fire on the Gila, which was also ignited with what I call drone strikes, fire drone strikes, and helicopters and so on. The question is, how many of those acres burned into absolute ashes? How many buildings, homes, people's lives were ruined, destroyed, et cetera, as a result of that? You recall that in 2020, the North Complex, as a result of this same kind of activity, purposely extending and expanding the size of a fire, killed 16 civilians in the town of Berry Creek. And that has not come to legal fruition yet, but it will. And so these are extremely consequential decisions that are treated very cavalierly by people who imagine in their minds over the years, and I know because I've been in the government myself, that they are indeed kings inside the boundary. And I'm not saying these are bad people. They have great, they're wonderful people. They have, they mean the best. They listen maybe to the wrong lights, and maybe they make the wrong decisions. But in the end, what they're doing, in my view, requires them to ask us what we think. And none of them have asked us what we think. They're the governor now, they've asked the governor what she thinks, Katie Hobbs, and she's asked for an investigation and so on. But investigations have a way of smoothing over the rough spots and wiping out memories and hard drives and so on. And that's another reason I wrote the piece I did as quickly as I did, because I didn't want to give the government time to frame this as anything other than the disaster that it was.
In listening to this, it brings to mind one of the most important things here is that in the First Amendment, we are guaranteed the ability to petition the government for redress of grievances. In the very beginning, if you had a grievance, you could come directly to Congress and they'd have to listen to you try to get your grievance addressed and maybe fixed. Well, they apparently didn't like a bunch of people coming into Congress, and so they passed the 11th Amendment, which kind of put that out as a way of getting a redress of grievances. And then subsequently, additional rules, laws, and amendments made it even more difficult to get redress. But isn't it true that there was a fire, wasn't there a fire in western Montana where a man's farm was burned? And isn't he now suing for a redress of grievances and making it some way through court?
Yes, there are a couple. The Alice Creek fire, I think, is what you're referring to, and there were a couple of ranchers, and firefighters fell back onto those. Well, they allowed the fire to burn because it was on the east side of the Continental Divide, and they figured it would stay there because that's a bunch of rocks. But it came over the divide, and when it did, they started burning from the low areas, from the canyon bottoms and so on, to try to slow its progress. But it wasn't about to be slowed because of these unexpected winds and hot, dry temperatures. And so then they decided they needed to fall back onto the flats and light a fire to try to stop the main fire. I guess in retrospect, they would have been better off not fighting the fire at all and just going home. But what they did is they lit these private ranches on fire, and those ranchers have sued under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is extremely difficult to prevail under that act. But they've made it through some important milestones, and we're now waiting for a decision from the judge in that case, the case of Alice Creek, to see if we can win one on this. It would be very important to the American people if they could, you think about Gaithersburg, is that it? No, Gatlinburg,
Oh,
where the
yeah.
Park Service park rangers decided for a whole. It's too complicated to talk about, but in the end, they let it go, and it killed a bunch of people and burned a bunch of houses. And Dolly Parton stepped in and gave everybody $5,000, and it was a touching story. But the government is pitifully armed to compensate people for these decisions that result in the taking of private property.
You mentioned something which is also important. One of my beefs with the Forest Service is that they do not do their job of keeping their access roads clear in our area. We have a lot of Forest Service roads that are just impassable. That's a way of keeping us out, keeping loggers out, and all of that stuff. That's our land, but they are actively impeding us from using our land. So what we have is we have a lot of fuel lying on the ground in places where they are supposed to be clearing it up. I remember seeing an incredible series of pictures of the Western Forest from 1906 through today, where in 1906 a man who was there on a horseback, and he was able to gallop at full speed through the national forest out there without tripping on anything, without having to jump over anything. And then subsequent pictures over the years shows more and more growth to the point where now that same exact location is completely impassable. Maybe with a team of people with chainsaws, they might get a little bit a ways in, but there's no galloping a horse through that area, and everything that's on the ground is fuel. So it's no surprise to me if you have a lightning strike, it's going to go, and there's just plenty of fuel lying on the ground, and I'm sure everything that I just said is true.
The Indians commonly at the close of the season in the fall would light the place on fire because the fire would run through and get rid of brush and obstacles and so on. It would also leave really great forage growing up in the regrowth in the following spring for their horses and animals and so on. And so that's in fact those stories of people riding four abreast for miles and miles in the Great Western Forest and driving wagons just across country in those open grown stands of pine trees with grassy floors. I've seen those forests before. There's still relics out there where they exist. And guess where one of the major ones is? On the north rim of the Grand Canyon, although it's rapidly disappearing. And
Well,
in
not
fact,
anymore. Not
I'm
anymore.
I'm hoping that the damage is not as horrible as it appears to be at this juncture, but it's hard to tell. And yeah, you've seen some maps. I showed you some heat signatures from satellites and so on, and it does look grim. There's a lot of heat on the ground, and ponderosa pine are armored against fire. They're extremely fire resistant. In fact, they depend on fire to be healthy. Ponderosa pine trees burned in one fire are basically fireproof if they live. They're fireproof for another 20 years at least. And so they need fire, and that's great, but they only have so much resistance. And if you have a bunch of people lighting stuff on fire with drones, uh, it's too much, too fast, too far, and
You know,
the consequences are too horrible.
well, that's another part of this that really uh, irks me, and that is that as part of this entire Forest Service and firefighting experience, they're not even satisfied to let nature take its course. They have to go and use drones to light areas on fire, which makes things worse. I don't see how that's any way making things better.
It's not, and it's a I call it Klingon battle language. When the Forest Service lost its ability to do timber sales and different things, as the Center for Biological Diversity sued them out of existence and into incompetence on those old skills that they had, they fell further and further back on wildfire as a management tool. And I submit that wildfire is a pitiful management tool. That's like, I don't know, it's like trying to treat your a toothache with a sledgehammer. It gets rid of the toothache, but it leaves some collateral damage. And so, yeah, I started working in fire in 1972. So I've been, for 50 years, I've been intimately involved in the whole evolution of planning and wildfire policy and fighting fires and wildfire practices and so on. And my friends and I who served on hotshot crews and were smoke jumpers and served in the upper ranks of the fire organizations and so on, we don't recognize these people. We don't understand what drives them now. What's the point of managing a forest? The point of managing a forest is to end up with a living, breathing, healthy forest. That's what we were taught. And so who are these people now that are running these giant expanding fires and so on that don't seem to think that that's a good outcome? On the 2020 North Complex, as I mentioned earlier, the sum total of this, they started lighting two fires together for various reasons, the Bear Fire and the Claremont Fire, on the 3rd of September. And it got up in predicted red flag conditions and ran 194,000 acres of prime California timber country and killed everything in sight. All the trees, elk, snakes, and 16 civilians caught in their beds and trying to escape their homes and so on. That's not good policy. The point, why do we have a Forest Service? To protect and to use our national forests for the greater good for the long term. Sustainable forestry, producing timber, clean water, wildlife habitat, minerals, wood, etc. You can't do that with a burned down forest. And the Park Service has a similar charge, which is to conserve and protect these beautiful, spectacular places, the best places of the West and the East. You can't do that if you're burning them down all the time. And it's not okay to say, oh, well, it's natural. The 300 employees who lost their housing on the North Rim on July 12th, they don't feel it's very natural, I'll bet you.
Well, I thought it was required for people put out fires. I thought that was part of the law. I thought that was part of the charge and job of the Forest Service and the Park Service. They have people who are supposed to be putting out fires, but they're not. I don't understand that construct. If the law says you're supposed to run in there and put the fire out, what are you doing not doing that? And we're paying for it. That's what irks me the most. Every single thing that you've talked about, we have paid for. We paid for all of that bad stuff. Everything bad that you mentioned, we have paid for.
Not only that,
we're not getting a return on our investment.
So my dad used to tell me, my dad was a forest ranger, and I couldn't work for the Forest Service until he retired because of nepotism laws. And so when I went to work for the Forest Service, he said, son, there's only two ways you can get fired from the Forest Service. One is for fiscal irregularity. You steal something or you take a bribe or whatever and you're gone. You may be in jail. And two is misappropriating congressional money. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's no law that authorizes this behavior on their part. And that's going to catch up to them. I think it's catching up to them now. You cannot just willy-nilly take congressional dollars that are set aside and appropriated, taxpayer dollars from you and me, to put fires out. The policy is simple. Put the damn fire out. That's what that WFM money is for. It's appropriated for that purpose. The minute you start expanding that or inventing new ideas, one of the euphemisms that are coming now are just appalling. For example, they say on this fire and other fires, on Sunday, on Monday morning, the National Interagency Fire Center published a wrap-up of the big fires in the West. And they said there were 34 large fires, which is more than 100 acres, being managed for full suppression. And at that time, there were 74 or 80 large fires being managed beyond full suppression, considering biological, cultural, vegetative, and other factors. And so I now think of that euphemism. It's a new one for me, and I love it. Beyond full suppression. Apparently, beyond full suppression means burning down lodges and lighting tens of thousands of acres of fire on purpose. The other one that they like to call on is firefighter safety. And of course, in the North Complex and the 16 people who died, none of them were firefighters. But it seems to me that that certainly public safety should rank up there with firefighters. And of course, they give lip service to that, but nobody asks the public what they think about that. And should we be doing that? I mean, one of the solutions to all of this is to stop this policy completely, go back to what was called before about 1970, 1980, the 10 a.m. policy, which was you're going to put that fire out by today immediately, or by 10 a.m. the next morning, no matter what. And that was the policy. And people have said, well, it's that policy that got us into trouble because we suppressed all these fires. They weren't allowed to play a natural role. And now we have this big problem. And I say, baloney. What happened was we got rid of the 10 a.m. policy, and we got rid of any kind of management, logging, thinning, silviculture, all of these things. And by doing that, we created this abundance of fuel that's growing and growing every day. And by doing that, we've created a crisis. And now we're compounding it by trying to fix the guy's teeth with a sledgehammer. That's not what you do. It takes
that's really the point here, is that we've really come full circle from what the whole purpose of the Forest Service was. The Forest Service was, as you have mentioned, the purpose was to give us protection, forests that we can play in, recreate, hunt, fish, and whatever else we wanted to, ride horses or whatever we wanted to do. There are forests, and they needed to be protected. The problem really comes down to the fact that the Forest Service has, in the past some years, 20, 30 years, they do not do the job in upkeep. They claim they don't have the money or whatever they claim. They are not keeping the forest up. They're not doing their job of clearing the roads. They're not clearing the deadfall so that you can walk through the forest. They are leaving the forest in a condition in which they are unusable. I think that's probably the point that they're trying to achieve. So, and that's, of course, a subject for another discussion. But when it comes to this fire here, I know your article and some of the articles have had some three key points, and I'm going to read those points, and I would like your final comments about them. The Bravo fire was small at first, but eventually grew to destroy dozens of structures at the Grand Canyon's North Rim, including the Grand Canyon Lodge. The fire's rapid growth, fueled by historically high winds, prompted evacuations and the closure of the North Rim for the 2025 season, and as you said, probably longer. And of course, state and federal lawmakers, including Governor Katie Hobbs and Senators Mark Kelly and Ruben Gallego, have called for an investigation into the fire. I agree with you again on that. Once Congress and once the government starts investigating anything, you do not get the truth. I could list a whole bunch of commissions and whatever of the government that have given us nothing but garbage and lies in order to justify bad action by government bureaucrats. So, Frank, what's your final take on this?
It takes things like this. It takes multiple deaths at a railroad crossing to get them to put in a barrier. And I'm hoping that this is a watershed moment when people can really look at what the outcomes of this policy can be, and we can have an actual real discussion with the agencies about why this is happening. The new chief of the Forest Service, one of the first things he said, the second paragraph of anything he said publicly, was he was going to order the immediate suppression of fires. What happened to that? Because it's not just on the parks. This is happening on the forests as well, including forests right next, right in the same area right now today. And so my final thought, I think, would be that this was a tragedy and it needs to be addressed that way. Leaders give their subordinates credit when things go right, and leaders take the blame when things go wrong. And we've heard nothing from the Park Service in the way of an apology for destroying this treasure of the American people. So I'm hoping that this is a giant jerk on the reins of these hubristic agencies and their fire policies in a way that we can all benefit from.
Well, I hope you're right, and what you say is absolutely true. There is no accountability now for anything the government does. That's the tragedy. We are being governed by really a bureaucratic state who does. They're not elected. We can't unelect them. We cannot touch them. They do what they want. We pay the price. They get paid. That's a tragedy. Our founders did not have that in mind, as you well know. So, Frank Carroll, again, every time we talk, it's always fascinating and interesting. I love your take on things, and I want to thank you so very, very much being again a guest and unfortunately having to discuss another tragedy in the national forests. One should never, ever, ever have happened.
Thank you.
You, Frank. We'll meet again soon, I know. Maybe on the range in the national forest, for all I know. That one that hasn't burned. We'll have to figure out which one that is.
We'll
But
find
anyway, thanks, Farrell. It's been Frank Carroll. It's been a great evening. Thank you for being a guest on Freedom Forum Live.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.